Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. We have a special guest joining us later on. I will introduce him in about 10 minutes or so when I just go through a few news items. As usual, you often hear me complaining that Scotland is a debate desert. It's really difficult to get people to come and talk about issues and look at different perspectives. But that's what we've got tonight. I'll introduce our guest a little bit later. Right, a few things from the news to start off with. Right, first thing I'd mention is I published a video at lunchtime today. Hamza Yousaf, Hamas and progressive Islamic politics. And it's on about 4,000 views, 14,000 views at the moment. I knew it would be popular. People would want to know about this. And it talks about some connections between Hamza Yousaf organizations he's been involved in and Hamas. Now, I hope you watch the video. Maybe you've watched it already, but do watch it after the live stream tonight or in the days to come. It's not at all sensationalist. I'm not jumping to conclusions from it or claiming things, from scanty evidence. I'm just saying, that these are the facts of the matter. What are Hamza Yousaf's views on these things? Well, it's quite hard to know. He's associated with people with very unsavory views, but what he thinks himself is quite difficult to discern. But I think we need to know. We certainly need to know the facts about his background and things he's been involved in. And then, let's hope someone eventually gets to ask him about these things. Probably a long shot in Scotland, but it's good to know. So I'm sure you would find that video very interesting. It talks about the way the SNP's cozied up to the Iranian regime as well, which you might find quite surprising. And Hamza Yousaf's views, if we go back about 10 years or so, the things he was tweeting, the things he was saying, the things he was involved in would make you think that there seems to be someone with sort of Islamist tendencies. Let's put it that way. Now, I think nowadays you don't really see that from Hamza Yousaf. It's very much, very definitely on the sort of pro-Palestine, anti-Israel side of the current conflict. But apart from that, you don't really see evidence of a sort of Islamic faith coming through into his politics. But 10 years ago, you definitely did. So the question I ask in the video is what's happened in the intervening 10 years? Has Hamza Yousaf changed his mind? Or has he thought, right, if I'm going to get to the top, I need to keep this under wraps a little bit more? And I genuinely don't know the answer. I genuinely don't know. But if you watch the video, you can form your own opinion. I say, I'm sure you'll find it interesting. But don't watch it yet. Go watch the live stream first. Right, I've got the comments there. Right, evening everyone, evening Kirsty. Thanks for the message early on. CO2. I think you're going to say about COVID in a minute. We'll talk about CO2 later. The COVID inquiry, that's worth a mention. Have you followed some of that? It's quite remarkable what's going on in Scotland about these messages. Well, just the Scottish government is just in the habit of secrecy. There's a culture that they think they can get away with covering things up. And it looks like maybe that's not quite going to work in terms of the COVID inquiry. But the UK COVID inquiry, it's just been shocking getting a glimpse to the behind the scenes of the operation of the government. Dominic Cummings just seems like a really obnoxious, unpleasant character, talking about people in the most scathing and sort of vulgar terms. How you can possibly expect to have a good functioning operational unit with someone like that poisoning the atmosphere like that within it, I really do not know. So there's a lot more for that to run. We'll commentate on that more fully. As has been the case recently, just quite regularly, a report comes out, some sort of analysis comes out, pointing out that the Scottish government's going to run out of money at some point, that they're just going further and further off the cliff into a black hole, financial black hole, which is extremely concerning. My view is that the Scottish government can't help it. They're just not capable of saying, whoa, we've got to change course here. We can't govern by just promising to spend more and more money on every problem that comes along. So if anyone's upset, if there's any issue, we'll say how many £1 million we're going to spend on it. And that's the way they govern the country. They can't, it's so ingrained, they can't get out of that. But the forecasts for the future are extremely dire. And there's been another one published within the last couple of days. And another little news story is quite interesting. I'm still following Michael Shanks, the new Labour MP, who won the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. And he's now supporting workers who are taking Asda to court with an equal pay claim. Now, these equal pay claims, you know how it works, don't you? Basically, men and women look at the jobs available, they choose which job they want to do the job for 10 or 20 years, and then go and see a clever lawyer and say, actually, this is not fair. I don't get paid as much as the people who do the job that I chose not to do. And then you take them to court and you win, and you get tens of thousands of pounds. Now, the job that they chose, so let's say someone chooses to work in the shop as a cashier or whatever within the shop, as opposed to working in the warehouse. In the warehouse, you might get paid a bit more money, might be a bit more noisy and cold and dirty, not as nice a place to work. So you take your pick. So you might choose, I'd rather be in the shop, a bit less physical, a bit of a nicer environment, rather than being in the sort of dirty warehouse. So you choose that, do it for 20 years, and then complain that you've been paid less than the person who said, you know what, I'm willing to work in the warehouse. Okay, it's a bit more, it's less pleasant work, but you get paid a bit more money, so I'm going to do that. And then the law, in many cases, the judgment has been made that the people who chose to work in the shop have to be paid the same amount as the people who worked in the warehouse. I mean, it's absolutely crazy, absolutely crazy. So Asda, I'm sure, are quaking in their boots. I mean, Glasgow City Council lost 1/3 of its annual budget a couple of years ago, over 1/3 of its total annual budget. The total annual budget is £1.5 billion, and they lost, was it like 700 or 800 million to an equal pay claim? It was really crazy. So that's what Michael Shanks is doing now that he's got elected. I'm sure his calculus is there's lots of Asda workers, so there's lots of votes there. How many people are bothered about how profitable Asda is? Tiny handful. So obviously, if you want to get the votes, that's the line you're going to take. But I could never take that because it's just not right. It's just not fair what's going on. Well, what else have we had in the news? We've had a bonfire night. And there was trouble in Dundee, I think, a few days ago. Some trouble in Glasgow. And then in Edinburgh, to cap it all, there was some mob throwing petrol bombs at the police. Throwing petrol bombs at the police. Now, I put on Twitter, as far as I'm concerned, if someone's throwing a petrol bomb at a police officer or anyone else, really, I mean, that's attempted murder, isn't it? I mean, you're trying to kill them. There's a pretty decent chance you're going to kill them. And if you throw the thing at them, aiming at them, you're doing your best to set them on fire and to kill them. And when I see rows of police officers with their riot shields, with people hurling things at them, basically trying to kill them, and just, it's like a game for them. I cannot bear to watch it. I think everyone there, the police should issue a message saying, you know, if you're throwing things at police officers or firemen or firefighters, whatever, petrol bombs, if you do that, then this is what's going to happen to you. And as far as I'm concerned, if someone's trying to kill a police officer, well, I think pretty extreme measures are justified in order to stop them doing that. Because at the moment, the attitude seems to be, oh, let them try. They can try and kill us. Okay, we might get injured a bit. Maybe a police officer will be killed eventually at one of these things. But that's just the price you have to pay. Then we'll try and arrest some of them later if we get the chance. Yeah, we'll film them or whatever. But I think it needs to toughen up. I think, you know, if you're so you're in one of these areas, you've made your Molotov cocktail, you've lit the rag in it, you're about to throw it at a police officer. I think what should be going through that person's mind is, right, I'm taking a massive risk here. In fact, I am terrified of going anywhere near a police officer with this lethal weapon in my hand. I'm terrified because who knows what will happen to me. I think that should be their frame of mind. But at the moment, their frame of mind is, well, hey, it's all good fun. Let's have some fun trying to kill some police officers. And, you know, they might catch me a couple of days later. You know, it's no big deal. So then something really needs to change there. And I think all those people doing that, trying to kill police officers in that way, as some of them have been arrested, they should thank their lucky stars, the Scottish family parties and the government, because things will be a lot more stringent in that regard. That's for sure. Right, I've got how many minutes in? I've got almost 10 minutes without mentioning the conference. Can you believe that? That's quite impressive for me. I'll just put the link in the comments. So this is the last live stream before our conference, which is in Glasgow on Saturday afternoon. Starts at 1:30, just outside the low emission zone, the absolute town centre, but still sort of fairly central. Glasgow parking, I think, is quite straightforward. It's only £10. That includes a drinks reception with nibbles at the end of it as well. Our attendance is going to be a record for the Scottish Family Party. We've never had so many people at a conference before. So do join us. We'd love to see you. It's open to non-members, and I guarantee you will enjoy it. Even if it doesn't lead to anything else in terms of joining the family party or getting involved in any way, I guarantee you will enjoy the day and you'll enjoy meeting like-minded people. So that's the conference, and the link is right there. Do get your tickets. I mean, time's running out. It's this Saturday, so do get your tickets there. One last thing before I introduce our special guest. There's a very encouraging news story this week. A couple of entrepreneurs have started a business making a sort of 4x4 vehicle, a sort of Land Rover-ish type vehicle, electric, and they're looking to upscale it. That's right, making 250 a year is the next target. They're fantastic, and that's really great. But what's the government's attitude to that? What's the government's attitude to businesses? My attitude is, we really need to do everything we can for this to flourish and succeed. If this becomes a really successful business, jobs for lots of people, just great. More money in the economy, more money for public services. This is an all-round winner. Let's encourage it in any way we can. Whereas the Scottish government looks at businesses and more thinks, right, they're the problem. Right, they're trying to make money. They're trying to make profit. Let's increase their taxes, tax them more and more. Let's get more and more regulations, more and more rules and bureaucracy for them to really crush it. Right, I would want to really let these businesses free to flourish and grow, and that would really benefit everyone. So hopefully this business will grow, but let's see over the years to come. Right, that's just a few news things, and punishments extend to those who aim. Yeah, absolutely. If someone goes throws a petrol bomb at you in the street, they're trying to kill you, and if the police are there and they see it happen, if they see the person running up to you with a petrol bomb, then I think literally any measure is justified to stop them throwing it at you. Absolutely anything. Live ammunition. If someone's about to throw a petrol bomb at someone in an attempt to kill them, then the police should do anything, absolutely anything, to prevent that from happening. Whereas the culture now is probably more, okay, if someone gets set on fire, easier to deal with that than to deal with a public inquiry going on for the next 6 years because someone got shot by the police. But I just think it cannot be allowed. You cannot have someone trying to set someone on fire and kill them while the police stand by and watch, and they're going, what are we supposed to do about it? We need a change. Grew up in these areas, mindset of it being normal. Absolutely. We could talk about the reasons for that. They are many and varied, and we've spoken about them on many occasions. But yeah, we want to get to, we want to deal with the cause, but we also want to deal with the symptoms as well. People need to be kept safe. Right. Oh, one last comment before we bring it on, John. And congratulations to Mary, the 40 Days for Life team. Yeah, the 40 Days for Life prayer vigil at the abortion clinic in Edinburgh finished on Sunday, and they had a gathering at the clinic there, and yeah, that was great. So well done to the team and Mary for doing that. It's a very powerful thing, and I think there's good reason to think that at least one person, in any case, seemed to change their mind in terms of going for an abortion and then deciding not to. There's every reason to think that happened on at least one occasion. But then there's lots of other reasons for doing this as well. But that was very encouraging. Right, let's bring our special guest. So our special guest we will welcome is Ben Richards. Ben, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
Now, Ben is coming to talk to me talk to us about climate change. Now, climate change is a very controversial topic. I would imagine some of our viewers might be quite skeptical. I think I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. Scottish Family Party policy, I won't talk about it now, we'll talk about it at the end. So everything that comes out of my mouth isn't Scottish Family Party policy. I'm just going to have a discussion with Ben, try to learn a few things, see what he's got to say. So I'd encourage you to do the same. Listen to what Ben's got to say. Some things you might think, oh, yeah, maybe that makes sense. Maybe you're not so sure about other things, but that's what debate is all about. So Ben, really appreciate you bringing your expertise to us. Would you tell people a little bit about yourself and how you come to this point?
Yeah, fair enough. So years ago, I did a PhD looking at glaciers in the Himalayas and the Karakoram. So amazing opportunities funded by the British government to research how the glaciers had advanced and retreated over very long time scales. You probably know that climate changes. You have glaciations, you have interglacials, ice ages, people call them. And so it was looking at that and the timing of those and trying to tease out how the monsoon changed over those long timescales. We're looking at about 70,000 years was the total length of time I was looking at. So that ends you up with a very good understanding of climate. But that finished in 95. At that point, I stepped sideways into a development role with a UK charity, worked in and out of South Asia for 20-something years, based in the London area. You can hear from my accent, though I have a lot of Scottish ancestry, it's not coming out in the accent. So 20 years in London, and these days now live and work in Paisley, and involved in a global charity out of a small base we have here. So speaking to you today in a personal capacity, and based on quite a lot of background understanding in terms of academia, but of course I'm not actually in an academic post. You might say that gives me more freedom to say things, actually. However, my day job does involve quite a lot of explaining science, and climate science included. So this isn't, I'm not sort of dredging back 20 years to bring you what I'm bringing today. Okay. I'm married, have children in the local schools here, and generally enjoying life back in Scotland.
Right, very good, very good. Right, I've got lots of questions. I said to Ben before, these questions, it's not like a sort of abstract. These are genuine questions that I'm asking. That I'm trying to clarify my personal response to these questions. So my first question: how confident can we be in climate science and its projections, and have the predictions coming from climate science been accurate thus far?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I think a lot of people will still have that question. Very few climate scientists, well, essentially no climate scientists, wonder that question. A few non-climate scientists do. So let's talk through the very essentials. The essential is called an energy imbalance. If you sit in a car on a hot day, more energy is coming into the car than is leaving. Therefore, you get hotter and hotter. If you sit in your house and you don't have the heating on in winter, it gets colder and colder. That's an energy imbalance. You're losing. You have a net loss. The analogy would be your own bank account, or perhaps a bath with a hole in it or something. You know, what we're looking at here in climate, in very simple terms, because the essential science is simple, is that we've put an extra blanket around the Earth that traps more heat than had been before. I wouldn't say that naturally occurs. There's other times in the Earth's history when we've had this much of a blanket around, almost anyway. And there's certainly times when the blankets have been taken off, as it were, or put back on. That blanket is heat-trapping gases. The majority of the heat trapping is actually water vapor, but the second most important one is CO2. It's a small gas in the total amount of the atmosphere, but it's enough to make a very big difference. And so through climatic history, let's imagine the last ice age, which is the last 2.6 million years. That's when you've gone in and out of ice ages. There's been just over a dozen of them. The amount of CO2 has gone up and down with the temperature. Now, to clarify, that is not the only thing that has caused that temperature change. And don't forget, these are enormous changes where where I'm sitting at the moment had 2 to 3 kilometers of ice over my head, as it were, during the maximum of the last ice age, which was 18,000 years ago. But that was actually caused primarily by small changes in the Earth's orbit. You can calculate those. We'd already got to a stage of low CO2 in the time before this 2.6 million years ago, and then that was triggered into the series of ice ages by small changes in the Earth's orbit, which essentially we've worked out from the slight wobbles that you can observe. It was then amplified by carbon dioxide, because as you cool the Earth, you can then have more CO2 dissolved in the oceans, then there's less in the atmosphere. And then you have this feedback where the CO2 takes over, as it were, and pushes you further into a cold period.
So can you just clarify this? So cooler water can absorb more CO2. My intuition would be that warmer fluids are better solvents, but that's not the case.
Now you've suddenly triggered my brain to say, have I got it wrong around? I'll come back to you. No, that's correct. Yeah, but with the greater, let's get this right. Let's move on to something else, but I'm going to come back to that because my brain won't give me the answers now. So carry on.
Yeah. So said about the fluctuations in temperature in the past. So you're saying the fluctuations in the past, quite dramatic fluctuations. CO2 hasn't been the main driver, but it has been a factor.
Well, it takes over as the main factor once you have another trigger.
Now, would that explain why I've heard people say that the CO2 graph tends to lag behind the temperature graph?
Yeah, in most cases it does. That's right. There's been other occasions further back in the Earth's history when CO2 has been the main driver. There was a very long period of volcanic eruptions emitting a lot of CO2 in India. This is, I think, about 60 million years ago. That caused a dramatic warming of the Earth's climate at that point. The total rate of CO2 emission at that point was about the rate of change was about 10 times less than we're seeing at the moment.
Right.
So it is possible for CO2 naturally, as it were, to cause these changes. But in the most recent past, where you've had changes due to what we call Milankovitch cycles, which is the changes in the Earth's orbits, that the CO2 lagged because it was triggered by an initial change.
Yeah. Now, another thing, I'm sure this is like from the first lecture of a course on climate change, but it's something I've wondered. So the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, does that prevent radiation of heat from the Earth?
Yeah, carbon dioxide is a good absorber and emitter of infrared wavelengths of light. So it allows the sun rays, which is of visible wavelengths and UV, to come straight through it, but it's opaque to infrared.
And so when the Earth is warmed up, the heat radiating from the Earth is of a different wavelength, different electromagnetic characteristics than the sun's rays coming through it.
No. If you warm up a body, then it emits depending on its temperature. That's why an infrared camera works, because you get different emissions depending on the temperatures that are emitted. This is black body radiation physics. So the Earth or anything else emits according to its temperature. So that will be infrared, because we are in the average global temperatures, I think, about 16 or 17 degrees centigrade. Incidentally, that average is only possible because of the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere. If we had none, we'd be at about minus 15 degrees average temperature of the globe. We'd basically be on a snowball Earth. So it's a mercy, as it were, or it's an extraordinary aspect of the natural world. But we have a natural greenhouse effect, which is keeping us warmer. And it is that we have enhanced that quite dramatically by putting a lot more carbon dioxide in. And we've put in about 50% more than was there before.
So let's look at my question. So the science of the Earth's climate, I'm sure, there's who knows how many different factors are affecting it. A very complex system. And the question is, probably quite a difficult question to answer, but my question is, basically, how accurate is the climate science? Because lots of, my confidence in science depends on the area that it's dealing with. So when I hear scientists talking about, the origin of the universe, I tend to think you really haven't got much to go on there, and you're grasping at the far end of a chain of mathematical reasoning, and I'm not that confident in your conclusions. Whereas things that people are repeating in a laboratory, week after week, and they keep getting the same, then I'm very confident in that. So on that spectrum, where does climate science come? And my personal intuition is it's a very, very complex thing. So my confidence in it is sort of at the lower end of my confidence in areas of science.
Okay.
Is that fair, or am I being
it's
unfair?
very well established. I'm trying to think what would be the best way to help picture it. There's no field of science where more papers are published. You're getting checks from all sorts of people. I have in lots of disciplines. There wasn't, of course, a climate science discipline 40 years ago. In fact, you know who the best climate scientists were at that time? Working for Exxon, who had a special unit looking at the potential risks of the extra CO2 they were adding, where they were adding to the atmosphere. And actually, their predictions were very basic climate models, have pretty much been borne out by the observations. I've got a slide on that if you want to show it.
Is that basically the pattern? The climate scientists have made predictions. They've said, right, 20 years' time, this is the situation we're going to be in, and they keep getting it right. Is that the situation?
There are a lot of different models out there. That would be very much an oversimplification to say that.
Right.
But overall, what we looked at in the 90s is what has happened. It all depends on how many emissions we have. We've actually reduced the emission curve slightly less than the worst case scenario we looked at in the 90s due to low carbon technologies. Actually, it seems to have reduced warming by, I think it was around 0.5 degrees compared to where we would be otherwise. So that's been important. Right. So how reliable is the science? We have an awful lot of different lines of data to show that we are definitely experiencing a warming. In addition to the good old thermometer, which we have a lot of thermometer readings going back, in most cases, around 100 to 150 years. There's a few in central England which go back about 350 years. It's the longest measured record. They all show a warming. In more recent years, we've had satellite data that also shows a warming. We have measurements of oceans going back about 150 years. That also shows
my question there is whether or not the models, which I assume are mathematical models, are they being found to be making accurate predictions as the decades unfold?
Essentially, yes. Essentially, yes. All of the major models are being borne out in what is seen. If you want a summary on that, I could send you a link. Carbon Brief did a summary on that about 6 years ago, where they looked at it all and referenced various papers that have done a detailed analysis of them. So essentially, yes, there are outliers, there are complexities, but
the predictions.
But that is because the essential aspect of simply picturing it as putting an extra blanket around the planet and therefore losing less heat than you're gaining, that is actually quite simple. Other aspects of it, like the details of where you're going to get extra warming or extra rainfall, that's very much harder to pin down.
Right.
However, it is clear from all data that as you have a warming atmosphere, you will have heavier rainfall. That's been borne out in the meteorological data, for example, in the UK very clearly. And there's far more heavy, intense rainfall now, even than 20 years ago, actually. But Storm Burbet, or whatever it was a couple of weeks ago, was one of those. It was able to dump more rain in a small area than it would have been able to had we had a typical late October temperature. Right. I mean, we're all familiar with the fact that warm air can hold a lot more moisture.
Yeah.
In Scottish winter, you're constantly cleaning your car of the moisture.
Yeah.
But
the distinction you made there, I think, was maybe the one I was about to bring out. So, if projections of the temperature of the globe are quite accurate, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there have been projections being made in previous decades about what's going to happen to sea level, about what's going to be underwater, and they just keep turning out to be wrong. And they're
if you have
because they're
okay, that may be. In fact, I remember a professor at Nottingham University where I did my undergraduate saying, but someone's just published a paper saying it's going to be up here in 10 years. That's rubbish. Yes, it was rubbish. So there haven't been many, but there have been some. I also find that the reporting of it is often dire by the mainstream press and extremist, or certainly saber rattling sort of nonsense. We've only got 5 years to save a planet. No, that's nonsense. That's not really the way scientists talk. They would have talked in a far more careful way, especially these days, having been criticised so heavily in the last 30 years. Sea level rise is slowly increasing. If you go back 30 years ago, it was about 2 millimeters per year. Last year was about 4 millimeters. It does vary. We're talking about a global sea level rise, and there are some areas where it's actually going down because of complicated aspects of how the internal parts of the Earth and the currents work. So it is slightly increasing. The essential prediction on sea level is if you melt glaciers, the water has to go somewhere. We'd be very stupid to think that you can lose significant amount of Greenland and us not have sea level rise. We will experience sea level rise the more we melt places like Greenland and indeed the Antarctic ice sheets, which are right on their tipping points, one or two of them. I've had detailed conversations with some experts in that area in the last year and a half, and they're very, very concerned to the extent that, see, if you're a climate scientist, you tend not to say what I'm saying now, which is they are very, very concerned. You tend to say, well, it seems that the range at which we might lose them is between 1.2 and 2 degrees. Well, where are we? We're about 1.2 degrees. So that's what he was prepared to say on record. But you could see from the informal conversation I'd had that no, we're very, very worried now that we might never be able to stop the. That's a stupid statement. But the melting of Greenland could quite increase very rapidly now, as we are having more times when it rains on its surface, as we're having a warmer overall temperature. If you go back 30 years ago, they were actually increasing mass on Greenland because there was an extra snowfall compared to what was happening before. But no, we're now looking at an increased rate of melting and a quite obvious feedback where the surface is ever so slightly lower. So it will inevitably get slightly more rainfall and less snow than it would have done at a higher altitude as it was. So that's one of the many feedbacks we get, or we can call them tipping points, actually, because it's hard to put it back again once you lose that out of its bottle, as it were.
Could you just go back to, you said, go back to it, people say, we've got 5 years, we've got 10 years or whatever. But my take on that has always been that when someone says, we've got 10 years to save the planet, I've always thought that's a very politically convenient figure. If you've got 20 years, it doesn't matter who you elect in the next election. There's time after them. If you've got 1 year, then, well, there was stuff on that you've got to. But if it's 10 years, then this next election really is the big one. I've always felt it's been, those figures seem to be designed to maximize the motivation to people to vote or whatever.
They probably are. That's right. I think the reality is the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the warmer it'll get. And there are many very serious consequences, not just increased rainfall, which is serious, and not just losing ice mass, which is serious, but is a longer term problem. There are many problems, including to do with food production, which matter. It is not a good idea to get to a stage where you have a lot more extreme weather, and we can definitely avoid that by more rapidly moving to a low carbon or a lower carbon economy here and abroad.
Yeah, right. That's great. That's question one done. Right. Question two. I think I have a concern that the way science often operates is that a consensus view becomes dominant, and that can be sort of self-sustaining. People who don't adhere to it, well, your career is very difficult. You don't get published. There are all sorts of, so a groupthink can take hold, and I think that's particularly likely to take hold where there's a sort of political side to it. Now, in every other department in a university where there's any issue with a political slant to it, generally a university department will go to the pretty hard sort of left-wing position, the position favored by left-wing politics. And so my fear is with climate change that there could be this element of groupthink and also the element of sort of a political skew coming into play as well. What could you say to reassure me that that's not the case?
I've heard this often. I think in the bigger picture, it helps if people knew scientists, particularly climate scientists. Most of us are people who like trumping around mountains, looking at glacial remains, or maybe the atmospheric scientists are interested in how the thing works, or traveling up to the Arctic or so on. I'm very interested in finding reality. If we wanted lots of money, we could work for any fossil fuel company, because many do. Some do, because that's where the money is, because you are providing an obvious economic return. So groupthink, there must be some of it. There will be some of it. I don't think it stands up to the scrutiny of the evidence that would be required to show another cause of the observed warming. So let's think about this a few steps. It relates to your first question, really, of how solid is the science. Nobody is going to come up with a reason why carbon dioxide does not actually trap infrared. It's its job in life. It's got a carbon and two oxygens, CO2. Mm-hmm. And therefore it wavers about. So it's not one of those areas of science where somebody's going to say, oh, do you know what? Butter isn't so harmful after all. We've just worked that out. It's not like that. You're building on knowledge. In fact, the first science was the mid 19th century to show this. There's no way to improve your scientific career better than by disproving a theory. But this theory has been absolutely solidly proved from every angle.
Well, do you think? I would suggest that
it was very, very clear in the 80s, theoretically. Well, it was actually clear in the 19th century, theoretically. By the 80s, we could observe something which looked like a clear signal away from the mean. And by the 90s, it was clear. And now it's very, very clear that we have a much warmer, far more energetic system than we used to. And the oceans have actually absorbed a very large, I think it's around about 90% of all the extra heat is in the oceans. And you can measure the ocean, particularly the surface of the oceans, has warmed incredibly.
I say my understanding of the history of science and philosophy of science would make me a bit less confident in that, because some people's assessment of the history of science is that a view comes to dominate within the scientific community. And even when that view is full of holes and is not really standing up, even when it is disproved in various ways, say the
classic point, which is the science advances one funeral at a time.
Absolutely.
Because finally the old guard has moved out of the way and we're able to advance into what's more reasonable as a theory. I'm not saying that there isn't such thing as groupthink, including maybe there will be some in climate circles. There will. But I think the overall certainty of where we are on this is really very solid. I've heard a scientist say a few months ago, it's more solid than, well, I didn't say more solid, it's as solid as gravity. In terms of what else could have caused this level of warming. We know the sun has got slightly weaker over the time. That's another thing that could change the global climate. We know the orbital parameters would be leading us very, very slowly towards the next ice age, perhaps about 1,500 years before we would get a decent increase in ice sheets if we'd left the system all alone. And we do know that CO2 and other gases trap heat. We can measure from space that we are losing less heat than we used to. We can add it all up. We can say, oh, look, that's what it is. We can measure the isotopic composition of the CO2, and lo and behold, it is long buried carbon, not carbon, which has gone through the current terrestrial system of biology. So there are smoking guns left, right, and centre.
The classic counterexample to that is like Newton's laws of motion, which you can every physics student in a school test them in the school lab, and they work absolutely. And they sent rockets to the moon, and for centuries they were just absolutely spot on. Then it was discovered that actually they only worked over a certain range. Beyond a certain range, then some other factors took over, and they didn't work. Now I feel with climate, I don't think this is a particularly skeptical position. I think this applies to all science. So there's always the possibility that no matter how well the models might fit the current data, at some point in the future, there might be the conclusion that actually, we thought we had this sewn up, but we've now realized that actually it doesn't apply. Now, I'm more concerned about that. The more complex and speculative and like non-experimental the area of science, the greater my concern that this might happen.
So what would it take for you to say to yourself, oh, actually, they probably know what they're talking about in that area. I'm going to be less. I don't imagine you abandoning skepticism altogether. It's a good, healthy thing. But there are certain points where one can say to yourself, okay, well, that's pretty clear. I'm going to agree with that for now.
I guess the question for me, I'm not really seeking to like assign a probability in my own head. What I'm interested in, I suppose, is practically, do I think it's reasonable to take measures to combat climate change? And the answer is yes, I think it is. So if I'm like, 70% confident that they're probably broadly right, so it's worth, it's worth taking this seriously and look at and doing something. I would say I'm sort of somewhere in there. I would say so. I'm very much open to the possibility that what we're currently hearing might turn out to be wrong in the longer term. But on the other hand, I do think, I'm not rejecting it out of hand. Okay, do bear in mind, this is not like, I'm not like the Scottish Family Party policy talking machine. This is just my personal views. If you want to read our policies, you can see them on the website on this area. But that's my personal views. So there's a degree of skepticism.
Yes, I'm aiming to be completely apolitical and stick to the data. So what you're moving towards there is some of the, well, I'll say it, many of the steps which would lead to a lower carbon economy bring other benefits. And I'm sitting right now at home. We have recently installed a heat pump with a little bit of a grant from the Scottish government. Actually, it's very beneficial. Thank you very much, guys. Some of it's a loan, some of it's a grant. The heat pump is providing heat using a quarter of the energy that the gas did to provide the same heat. So that is a net benefit to the economy because we're importing less gas. Don't forget, most of our gas is imported. We have very mature basins in the North Sea. So that's a technology which I thought I better try it out before I recommend it. It's working wonderfully. It's very quiet. We had to change a few radiators. We had to anyway. We just moved house. Things could be improved. So that's an area where I think quite a large number of our properties would do better, run more cheaply, and we'd have this benefit of Scotland's amazing wind resource, which is quite astronomical.
Just stay with heat pumps for a moment.
Okay.
Do people, I'm quite ignorant of this, do people buy heat pumps without any sort of subsidy, just as an economic decision?
You can do, but probably not, because at the moment, the installation of a heat pump is still going to be more expensive than a gas boiler, and the payback time would be long. In England,
a lot of businesses have them, don't they? Is that subsidy or is that just an economic decision?
That's just economics. And actually, an air-to-air heat pump, which is essentially an air conditioner, but on heating mode, seems to be economically more sensible still than the air-to-water ones, which are pushed and have a grant. There's no grant for an air-to-air. And it will warm a property more cheaply and with a lot less energy input. Don't forget, gas is cheaper than electricity. So
comment on that? Is that the
common concentrate? It's perfectly practical in cities. Don't forget, in cities at the moment, you have gas boilers emitting quite a significant impact on air quality. In London, it's the second worst source of contributors to bad air quality, because although it's very clean compared to, say, coal gas or whatever from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it's still, natural gas still burns with a certain amount of NOx and a certain amount of other poisons, CO, for example. So, I mean, you're getting slightly off my area of expertise now. I'm onto my personal story, but I do think that in many situations, a well-installed heat pump would be a good source of heat, and obviously it's low carbon. And by the way, there are some terrible stories of people who've had heat pumps installed that don't heat their homes or cost a bomb to run or whatever. But yeah, that's a reality. And so getting a good installer is very, very important. I will just mention Heat Geek as a good network of people who certify installers. There's some in Scotland, including our own installer, who I won't mention.
I guess overall, my view on all these alternative energy sources, heat sources, etc., that if they were generally better, the government wouldn't need to be doing anything. If they were generally cheaper, the government wouldn't need to be doing anything. People would be making the shift.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I think that's right, and I think that will be shown over time. The thing is that the government is subsidising the old technology. So we have look at the price of gas versus electricity. Gas has none of the levies on it, whereas electricity has a lot. There's a historic reason for that, because they used to view that coal-fired electricity was more carbon intensive than the gas. But now that's not really fair, but we pay quite a lot more per kilowatt hour for electricity because of various levies, including the warm homes discount, that sort of thing, are put onto those. So that's a government decision. Internationally, $7 trillion was used to subsidize fossil fuels last year, which is quite an astronomical amount. I think the global economy is $50 trillion. So that's pushing in the wrong way. And of course, I totally believe in the market, but it's heavily weighted for the old economy rather than what I'd say is the new economy. There are other things like solar panels. There's no particular subsidy on those, and they repay maybe 7-8 years, depending on how you do your tariffs, and you have a battery or not. So, you know, that's rough. That's better than a savings account, but it's still not fantastic, is it? If you're in Cornwall, it's better. If you're in Portugal, it's better still. So there are a lot of these things are quite close to being market competitive, but we must not ignore that the government has actually historically subsidized the other side very, very well. Okay. Not least that when you burn gas, where does the waste product go? There is a waste product. It's carbon dioxide. Just like
a lot of countries that have reduced their carbon emissions most dramatically, developed countries, a very large part of that often is moving to gas, isn't it? From coal.
Yes, but if you look at the UK's change, which has been dramatic, initially that was moving from coal to gas for electricity generation, and then subsequently it's mainly been offshore wind. It's around about a half of the UK's energy was from non-carbon sources last year. So that's about 20% of that is nuclear. The rest of that is wind and solar. Scotland, meanwhile, has an enormous wind resource. I think we produced more electricity than we needed from wind alone last year. On low wind days, we still got a lot of wind from some part of the country because it's almost always windy somewhere. And then we could import the rest and run the gas for those other occasions.
Just to clarify that statistic, produce more energy than we needed from wind. That's like taking the total energy generated from wind, which obviously isn't consistent and couldn't be used to meet our energy needs.
Right.
The Scottish government band is about a statistic, doesn't it? 97% of our electricity was.
Yeah, I know. But on many days, it does provide all of what we need, or very close to all of what we need. If we finally get the connection to Norway built, where they have lots of wonderful hydroelectric power stations that they can turn on and off and sell it to us when we've got a low wind day, we may even find that just Norway, Scotland, with our connections to England, the English grid perhaps, would cover most of what we need. Meanwhile, up the hill here in Paisley, they are building a 20 megawatt hour battery system, which there is no subsidy for that. They've just found they can fill up the batteries when prices are low, maybe overnight, and sell it when prices are high, which would be breakfast time or for evening peak. And just on that arbitrage, they are able to make money. And there's several others in Scotland as well. So the battery technology price, again, is coming down and down. It's still expensive, but it's now commercially viable for companies to build such installations.
Yeah. Now, my next question is, well, I find it very interesting more than a case. When it comes to the issue of climate change, the general picture is the left of politics are wanting to take more drastic government action to deal with it. People on the right of politics tend to be less keen to do that. Well, why is that? Why has it become a left-right issue?
Yes, I've got an opinion on this without necessarily being quite authoritative. I note from America that the earliest proposals were actually from a Republican Party. There are quite a few Republicans that have a very clearly defined market-based way to lower emissions. They don't get much of a hearing in the current Republican Party, but they are, right of centre as individuals, as politicians. In the UK, we had really very good cross-party agreement until really quite recently. Boris Johnson, extraordinarily, seemed to be convinced by the briefing he had early on in his premiership. And for all his problems, he did at least, in my opinion, he did at least get this sort of thing more right than some others. I think early on, this is my opinion, early on, a lot of the solutions, a lot of the solutions were market-based. Then there was a lot of disinformation by fossil fuel companies to say this is an attack on your freedoms. These are ways of increasing government control. And at the same time, an awful lot of the proposals did sound extremely left-wing and were probably pushed by a lot of left-wing commentators. Much more's the pity, really, because really this is a huge market opportunity. This is the moment to retool the economy, to make a lot of money, to improve our economy, selling the things to all sorts of other parts of the world. The fact we have decarbonised so rapidly, even though an awful lot of wind turbines were built actually on the continent and installed by Danish companies and so on, what a shame. We could have built them. We could have built them in the first.
That sounds like, I sometimes hear, for example, Labour politicians speaking, and it is as though they're saying, adapting to reduce carbon emissions is going to boost the economy. Now, there are obviously going to be some sectors that are going to be boosted, but the overall picture is that energy will be more expensive, and that's going to harm the economy, and it's going to make us poorer. I mean, that's the big picture, isn't it?
But, that's a big picture from 15, 20 years ago. The price of solar, that's only going to have a partial application in Scotland, but the price of solar has plummeted by a factor of 10, so it's a tenth of what it was 10 years ago. It continues to decline. I think roughly every doubling of production, they find they can achieve a 20% reduction in cost. So it's a well-known, it's like a Moore's law of computers. The more you do it, the more cheaply you manage to produce it. So I think it's very, very much cheaper to do that. There's a great plan to build a whole load of those in Morocco and build a huge cable all the way across the Bay of Biscay to Cornwall and thus power parts of the UK. Well, that apparently is financially viable. It's extraordinary because the stuff is so cheap. It's still, if you're putting it on your house, it's still going to cost you a lot because you've got to pay someone to put the scaffolding and the electrician and so on. But overall, these things are coming down in price to where they are a lot less, particularly than during the Ukraine crisis, than gas-fired electricity.
Yeah.
And the important thing here, of course, still is storage. I mentioned Norway and the hydroelectric power. There is a new pump storage scheme being built, I believe, in the Great Glen. So there should be. I hope there could be more. It would really help. Ben Cruachan is doubling its capacity as a pump storage capacity. They match very well with wind and solar. Wind, of course, is far more powerful in the winter, solar more in the summer. And then batteries. I mean, it just seems so ridiculous that you'd have quite a complicated thing like a lithium-ion battery serving the grid, and yet the prices come down so very cheaply. South Australia now has, I think it's 75% of its total electricity is from renewables, and that's only possible because they have some very large grid batteries. which take them over their peaks,
Yeah.
famously installed by Elon Musk after a bet.
Mm-hmm.
So in the range of views on these things, there are people who say we are doomed, it's absolutely terrible, we're too late. And then there's people who say, well, you know what, we're very ingenious. An awful lot of the technology that we need is now available and being deployed at scale. All we need to do is to deploy it more rapidly. Then we could reduce the level of, we could reduce the emissions and thus bend the curve, as it were, to get to a stage where we can have at least a stabilization of climate, which roughly happens when you get to net zero. So you're absorbing the same amount as you're emitting. Then you at least get to a stabilization of temperatures.
Yeah. Now whenever I hear environmental activists, they talk about the impending climate catastrophe. We've got to absolutely do everything to stop it because we're all doomed. Then you say, okay, well, how about nuclear power? They say, oh, no, we don't like that. And as far as I'm concerned, someone's credibility sort of goes out of the window. It goes out of the window.
Nuclear does take a very, very long time to build. Nuclear takes a very long time to build, and it's very expensive. You also can't ramp it up and down to cope with what you need.
Is it really expensive? I was reading something the other day. It was saying that nuclear power, when you take away all the subsidies and all that sort of thing, it's actually the cheapest. But why do so many countries do it? It seems to me the countries don't use nuclear power for other reasons, and if it's just down to the economics, then they do, and they do it big time, like in France, etc. So, is that not fair?
Yeah, I just don't know enough, actually. I do understand that it's more expensive than renewables, including storage. I've heard figures of around 10 times more. It has other advantages. There is presumably, but you're slightly more secure, at least in theory, because you can have your own supply of fuel and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think we should get off this one because it's not one I have a strong opinion on, except that I do. I think it would be an opportunity cost to wait 10 to 15 years to build a large fleet of nuclear reactors in the UK, when at current rates, we can get an awful lot of that with wind and solar and storage and interconnection. I think we can get most of what we need that way at a much lower price. Yeah,
these small nuclear reactors are getting pretty close to the...
It takes a very long time to certify these things. Anyway, we should get off nuclear because it's not my area.
Look, Hamish's question is so long, we've disappeared behind it. 49 gigawatts of electricity generation assets will go offline by 2035, a mix of nuclear, fossil fuel, and older renewables. So about 14 gigawatts of new build capacity must be added each year if projected demand in 2035 is to be met. Can this realistically be achieved, given that the annual added capacity is currently only slightly more than 4? So so basically we're not building enough electricity generation capacity. It doesn't matter what sort it is. There's just not enough of it, and we've just got to get more of it.
Oh, yeah, but there's no fundamental reason why you can't scale it. And in fact, you know what? The biggest limitation is actually grid capacity. We have a grid which is based around large coal-fired power stations still, and some nuclear, and that's not where the current sources of new generation are. So you end up with bottlenecks in the grid. But I mean, if anybody's young and looking at a career, then having a career as a grid engineer, I think you would always be employed in the next 50 years. There's no fundamental reason why you can't build rapidly with wind, particularly offshore wind, and solar and storage, and the prices are coming down as we do it. And actually, it employs a large number of people as well. So I think it's a valid point. It just says, yes, we need to get on with it.
For those with basically unreliable sources, wind and solar. But surely,
right word. No, unreliable is not the right word. They are predictable. They are predictable. Some other things are also unreliable about the conventional system. If a nuclear power station has a fault and needs dealing with, it might be offline for 2 years. You may not have any notice on that. You do sometimes. 2 years ago, we found that gas and oil supplies were not as reliable as we thought, even though most of ours did not come from Russia. Still, the global supply for gas went up in price enormously, and we had to compete with others for the gas supply we thought we had for sure from Qatar. So it turns out that actually that's also not always a reliable source. And whereas if you have got your fleet of renewables onshore or in your own territory, it's reasonably secure. Perhaps Russia could bomb them all. Let's hope we don't get into that situation. But it would be the same with
to be honest, I'm not entirely convinced by your answer there. That sounds a little bit like, okay, solar-powered cars, they only work when the sunshine. Oh, but other sorts of cars break down as well. It seems to me like, okay, of course, there's going to be some unreliability in any. And like
you have to acknowledge the problems of the old as well as the problems of the new.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, I've got a few more questions. We need to finish very, very soon. This is very interesting. Adaptation. Some people argue, okay, the climate's we're going to warm up a bit, but actually humans can adapt, and it's not going to be that big a deal. Okay, there will be costs, there'll be problems, but basically we can solve them, and that's what we need to be. Well, we're focusing on more. Would you agree with that?
Fine. Adaptation is something we are already doing and will do a lot of. We are extremely ingenious as a species. We have tremendous technologies. We will adapt to a vast amount of things. There are some temperatures which would be very hard to adapt to because you get to a stage where it's harder to ensure you're growing enough crops for people, and you can have simultaneous staple crop failures. India, for example, this year has had a reduction of its wheat yield of about 20% because of a heat wave earlier in the year. They've actually banned exports. They did the same last year, actually, after another heat wave. So that's important. We can, of course, there's a huge amount of adaptation you can do in the agriculture world, but there are some areas of the world which it gets hard for people to live in as the temperature goes up. The problem there is what's known as the wet bulb temperature, and it's a combination of humidity and heat. It's worth exploring this because this is really very critical. I've lived in parts of the world where it gets to the upper 40s, occasionally to 50. At that point, if you are outside doing physical work, you are really pushing your body about to its limit, because no matter how much you sweat, you can't lose enough heat to keep your body core temperature to the 36, 37 that we need. It's all right. You can go perhaps into an air-conditioned place. Perhaps you work overnight. People are now doing that in parts of America to avoid the heat stress. But you can get to a stage with high humidity and those kind of high temperatures where the body cannot lose enough heat through perspiration. Even if you're sitting in the front of a fan with perhaps no clothes on or whatever, you are starting to effectively cook. Now, we've had a few episodes in the Gulf in the last 5 years where there's been several hours of that. There are a few cases in Pakistan 2 years ago with several hours of that. We don't seem to have had that in previous years or generations. So that's a case of where just an extra degree or two, when combined with a humid day, will become lethal for anybody who can't be in air conditioning. So air-conditioned tractors, maybe, but you are looking at large parts of the world, central India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Gulf areas. Many of those are poor. You can't expect large deployment and running of air conditioning. And so I fear, me talking as a human being, having been to these places, knowing people, but many of those people simply will have to move. And I don't know where they're going to go. I also fear, this is the climate scientist, not in a career climate, I can talk candidly, I fear there will be a mass mortality event of heat-humidity combination, probably in the Indian subcontinent, within the next 10 to 15 years. That's not a prediction. It's just the sort of thing which now looks on the cards, but wasn't on the cards 15 years ago, because we wouldn't have been exceeding these particular thresholds. It's about, there's a graph there, but 100% humidity, it's about 35 degrees centigrade. So very few places have 100% humidity. But this is very serious. You're looking at parts of the world no longer being inhabitable, let alone being productive for food.
Now, obviously, it's not this simple. As you were saying, people can't just move, but So on the other side of that, there would be areas of the globe which are currently uninhabitable because of cold,
Yeah.
or infertile, but would change and
Yeah,
would become
we'll change what
inhabitable.
we grow in Scotland. There will be
Uh-huh.
some parts of Siberia which maybe can become a breadbasket, maybe some parts of northern Canada. The soil isn't great for it at the moment. But yeah, there will be. You've also got the challenge of say the American Midwest, where soil moisture is reducing because you've got higher temperatures. You need a certain amount of soil moisture to germinate your crops. So there are so this is where you get into actually a lot of warming would be really very serious, and we'd have to do a lot of work of adapting to be able to keep feeding large numbers of people. There's other areas about completely the other end of the scale on adaptation. My father-in-law helped build a church building in the Midlands of England a few years ago, and by 5 years ago, he probably built it about 40 years ago actually. By 5 years ago, the intense rainfall they were having meant it kept flooding. So what did he do? They arranged for a second downpipe next to the existing downpipe. And I think a large number of buildings would just do with more downpipes to deal with the extreme, the more intense rainfall that we are now experiencing. Other areas of adaptation, if we've recently bought a house, we deliberately did not buy a house which is at the bottom of the hill. The SEPA flood warnings maps, which you can look up online, actually showed the house next to it might flood in a 1 in 100-year flood, which will be more frequent now, I'm afraid, but didn't show that one. Well, it was an error in the map. I, with my expertise, worked it out and said, no, we're not going to put a bid on that one. So, if you have the possibility to avoid living close to a watercourse, it's a good idea. Don't forget, most people's reactions to flooding these days are, that has never flooded, or it's never been this bad. So we are experiencing things which haven't happened much or have never happened, like a 40-degree temperature in Yorkshire last summer. Probably has never happened. We have reasonably good paleoclimatic data that looks at that. And we're also experiencing what used to be rare as a relatively common event. I think last month's storm, and indeed for one in southern England last week, was one of those ones which would have been very rare in the past, but it's been supercharged by a warmer, more energetic atmosphere. So we will do lots of adaptation. We'll need to. I recommend it, preferably before you get flooded, preferably before you're in a situation where, well, I think an awful lot of work has to be done around food supply. And I think we'll probably crack it. I just don't think we could say, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. There is a lot of work being done already, but there can be more. I've got a headline slide, which I sent you actually, about a large number of farmers saying in Scotland, saying the floods in Aberdeenshire has ruined their crop. Last weekend's rainfall in Ireland has destroyed large parts of the potato crop. Well, at the moment, we're a rich country. We're able to buy from somewhere else. But you can imagine this is happening more frequently than it used to. We're going to have to find ways to feed large numbers of people in a different way.
Yeah. Well, time has flown by. We've covered most of the things on my list. I've certainly learned quite a few things from you this evening, which I always want to do. That's been very helpful. Just to reiterate, our Scottish Family Party policy, to give a rough summary for those of you watching might not be aware of it. Our policies start in terms of climate change. It starts off by saying measures to reduce carbon emissions. So it doesn't start off by saying, any sort of degree of confidence or certainty in the seriousness of the climate change issue, but it just says measures that are taken. The decision-making process needs to take into account all factors. It needs to take into account the costs for individuals, particularly poorer people, etc., etc. So in a sense, I don't think anyone could read our policy and disagree with it, because all it says is consider all different factors and try and make sensible decisions, balancing the different factors. But what we're really getting at, I think, is a feeling that currently the Scottish government has, in some cases, taken and the UK government as well has taken decisions where they haven't balanced all of the factors, and the prices to be paid sometimes haven't been fully considered. So that's basically what our policy is. And also, if we had a couple of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, when our first job wouldn't be to try and get onto a committee that's dealing with climate change, because there's plenty of other people doing that already. We would have other priorities. In the longer term, we'd have to look at this more seriously. When we're going to be the government of Scotland in 50 years' time, then we'll need very detailed policies. But that's our position at the moment. So thanks very much for watching, everyone, and those of you who are going to watch later. Ben, thanks for coming on. Say very, very interesting to talk to you. So Scotland's the debate desert, but there's been a little oasis this evening. And I say you've answered some of the questions that I've got. I've still got my doubts in some areas.
I have one thing to clarify.
Yep.
A colder ocean does allow more CO2 to absorb in it. So
yes. Someone backed you up in the comments there as well. So, right. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. And see you at the conference. Those of you watching, do get your tickets. There's a link there in the comments. And see you next week. Right. Good night.